It was raining hard that morning, the kind of steady downpour that makes the hospital parking lot look like a sheet of dull silver. I remember walking in with my coffee cup too full, trying not to spill it while balancing my bag over my shoulder. My mind was already on my afternoon appointments, routine cases, nothing remarkable. At least, that's what I thought. The hospital was quiet for a Tuesday, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of shoes on polished floors. I had just hung up my coat in the staff lounge when a nurse, Jessica, walked in, dripping from the rain. She looked unsettled. "Dr. Kent," she said, lowering her voice, "you need to come to room 12. It's Mr. Dalton." My first thought was that his vitals had dropped. He'd been in a vegetative state for 11 years, stable but unchanging. Room 12 was practically a part of my weekly routine. Check his vitals, scan for pressure sores, speak briefly with his sister if she was visiting. "What happened?" I asked, setting my coffee down. Jessica hesitated, as if unsure whether to say it out loud. "You said something. Clear as day." I stared at her. "Said something?" She nodded, still frowning. "He said your name." For a second, the room felt too small. My coffee steamed quietly beside me, untouched. This was the kind of thing you heard about in sensationalized articles, not in the break room of a modest community hospital in Springfield, Missouri. "You're sure it wasn't a reflex?" I asked. My voice came out sharper than intended. Jessica crossed her arms. "I've been here 13 years, doctor. I know the difference between a reflex sound and a word. It was your name. Twice." I walked out before I even realized I'd made the decision. My shoes clicked against the hallway tiles, my pace quickening as we turned the corner toward the long-term care wing. The smell of antiseptic grew stronger, mixing with the faint aroma of oatmeal from breakfast trays. It was all so ordinary, but my chest felt tight. Room 12's door was half open. The blinds were drawn against the rain, leaving the room dim except for the glow of the heart monitor. Mr. Dalton lay in bed just as I'd seen him hundreds of times before, eyes half closed, face slack, skin pale from years indoors. His sister Mary sat by the window, knitting, her chair angled toward him. She looked up as I stepped in. "Morning, doctor." Jessica followed me inside, and I walked to the bed. "Mary, did you hear him speak?" Mary set her knitting aside slowly, her eyes searching mine. "I thought I was imagining it. I was telling him you'd be by later, and then, he said your name. Like he knew you were coming." I leaned over the bed, speaking clearly but softly. "Mr. Dalton, it's Dr. Kent. Can you hear me?" At first, nothing. Just the steady beep of the monitor and the hiss of the oxygen tube. Then his lips moved, dry, slow, and I heard it. "Laura." It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. For 11 years, I had known him as a silent figure in a bed, his world reduced to blinking lights and the shifting of a pillow. And now my name, spoken like it had been waiting behind his lips all this time. I tried to keep my composure. "Yes, it's me," I said, my voice steady but my hands cold. "Can you say something else?" His mouth twitched, his brow furrowing faintly. "Cold," he whispered. Jessica inhaled sharply behind me. Mary's hands were trembling. I checked his blanket. It was warm to the touch. "We'll get you comfortable," I told him, glancing at Jessica to adjust the temperature. But my mind was already spiraling. Was this a brief neurological spark? A trick of the mind? Or was he coming back to us? The rain drummed harder against the window. I pulled up a chair, deciding right there that I wasn't leaving the room until I understood what was happening. "Mr. Dalton, can you tell me your name?" He blinked slowly. His eyes, once dull and unfocused, seemed to fix on me with the faintest trace of awareness. "James," he murmured, and then, almost inaudibly, "Dalton." Mary covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling instantly. "Jimmy," she whispered, as if saying his name back to him could anchor him here. I asked simple, grounded questions, each time holding my breath for an answer. "Do you know where you are?" "Hospital," he said. "What year is it?" The pause. Then, "Don't know." I glanced at Jessica. She shook her head slightly, as stunned as I was. A sudden flash of memory came to me. 5 years ago, I'd been reviewing his scans with another doctor, both of us concluding there was no realistic pathway to recovery. I had said those exact words. And now, here he was, proving me wrong in real time. Mary moved closer to the bed. "Jimmy, it's Mary. I've always been here." He turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion, toward her voice. "Mary," he said softly, and I saw something pass between them that made my throat tighten. The medical part of my brain was screaming to run tests, to record this, to call neurology upstairs. But another part of me, the human part, wanted to just sit there and not break whatever fragile thing was happening. Jessica stepped out to page respiratory for a quick check, leaving me and Mary in the room. The monitor kept its steady rhythm, rain still tapping the glass. I leaned closer. "Mr. Dalton, can you tell me what you remember?" His eyes shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his expression. Noise, falling, pain. Mary's fingers clenched the armrest of her chair. "That was the day at the mill," she whispered to herself. I noted every word in my mind, careful not to press too hard. The last thing I wanted was to overwhelm him. When Jessica returned, she handed me a clipboard. "Vitals are holding steady. Respiratory says his oxygen levels are fine." I nodded, still focused on him. His gaze was steady now, more alert than I'd ever seen it. This wasn't random. This wasn't a reflex. In that moment, I felt the quiet weight of 11 years of silence, pressing down on this room, and lifting, if only slightly. Whatever was happening, it was real. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. For a moment, the room felt suspended in silence, like the air itself was listening. Mr. Dalton's eyes stayed locked on mine, their pale blue catching the dim light from the hallway. He blinked once, slowly, then parted his lips again. "He stayed," he whispered. I frowned, leaning closer to catch every syllable. "What do you mean, James?" His gaze drifted toward Mary, then back to me. "You always here." The words were broken, fragile, but there was intention behind them. I glanced at Mary, who was already wiping at her eyes. "Jimmy, she's been here every week," I said softly. He gave a faint nod, the muscles in his neck trembling with the effort. His breathing hitched slightly, so I gestured to Jessica to check the oxygen flow. She adjusted the tube under his nose, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he said something that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't an accident. Mary's hands froze in her lap. Jessica's eyes snapped to mine. "James," I said, my tone careful, "can you tell me what you mean by that?" He blinked twice, as if the effort of speaking was weighing on him. "Someone pushed." The words landed like a hammer in the quiet room. My mind scrambled to process it. His accident had always been reported as a fall from the upper platform at the lumber mill. There had been no investigation beyond the initial workplace safety report. I'd read it a dozen times over the years. It was straightforward, almost boring in its detail. I steadied my voice. "Do you remember who?" His mouth opened, then closed again. His brow furrowed, like he was searching for something in the fog of memory. Mary sat forward, her voice shaking. "Jimmy, was it someone you knew?" His eyes shifted toward her, and a shadow passed through them, something between fear and resignation. "Yes." A slow, uneasy tension filled the room. Jessica quietly excused herself to fetch the portable recorder we sometimes used for patient evaluations, but my focus stayed on him. His breathing had steadied again, though the effort to speak was clearly draining. "James," I said gently, "it's important. Can you tell me what happened before you fell?" His eyes flickered as he stared past me, as if watching something play out in his mind. Arguing loud. Told me, "Stay quiet." His voice thinned, each word a battle. "But I was falling." Mary let out a small gasp, covering her mouth. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. This wasn't just a random recollection. This was narrative. Connected. Intentional. And if even part of it was true, it rewrote the history of his injury entirely. Jessica returned with the recorder, placing it discreetly on the side table. She gave me a look, professional but edged with concern. "James," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "you're safe here. No one can hurt you. Can you remember where you were when you heard the arguing?" He hesitated, eyes darting to Mary again. "Mill office upstairs." That didn't fit with the original report. The documents had said he was working on the platform when he slipped. If he had been in the office first, something about the sequence was wrong or deliberately altered. Mary's knitting lay forgotten on the floor. Was it the foreman?" she asked quietly. His lips moved, but the sound barely came. I leaned in. "Don't trust him." My pulse kicked up. I had no right to leap to conclusions, but the pieces were beginning to hint at something far bigger than I'd walked in expecting this morning. I decided to change course, give him a break from the heavier questions. "James, do you remember what season it was?" His eyes softened and a small smile, faint but real, appeared. "Cold, smelled like pine." Mary smiled through her tears. "You always loved the winter shipments." He gave a small hum, and for a moment, the room felt lighter. Then his face tightened again, and he looked at me with startling clarity. "They lied," he whispered. The air seemed to still. "Who lied, James?" He shut his eyes, his breathing deepening, and I knew he was slipping toward exhaustion. I waited, giving him time, hoping he'd push through. But the words didn't come. His chest rose and fell slowly, his lips barely parting. Mary looked at me, her voice a quiet thread. "Do you believe him?" I didn't answer right away. As a physician, my instinct was to demand corroboration, to look for measurable proof. But there was a weight in his voice, a deliberate shape to the words he'd spoken. "I think he believes it," I said finally. Jessica spoke from the corner. "I'll get the speech therapist down here this afternoon. Maybe we can catch more while he's lucid." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, flipping through every conversation I'd ever had about his case, every note in his file, every detail that seemed too neat. Mary leaned closer to her brother, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Jimmy, I'm here," she said, her voice trembling but steady. His eyelids fluttered open, and he looked at her. "Don't let it happen again." Her face went pale. "What do you mean?" But he didn't answer. His gaze drifted to the ceiling, his breathing steady but slower now. I sat back in the chair, my thoughts a tangle of medical protocol and human curiosity. I'd walked into room 12 expecting another routine visit, chart the vitals, update the file, move on. Instead, I had a patient in a long-term vegetative state speaking in complete, meaningful fragments about events that contradicted everything I thought I knew. As I stood to leave, Jessica caught my arm. "You realize," she whispered, "if this is real, someone's been hiding something for over a decade." I didn't answer. Not yet. But as I stepped out into the hallway, the distant echo of his words, "It wasn't an accident," followed me like a shadow I couldn't shake. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that whatever this was, it was going to change far more than just his medical file. The hallway outside room 12 felt unusually long as I made my way toward my office. My footsteps echoed against the tile, each one landing heavier than the last. The hospital felt the same as it always did, muted voices at the nurse's station, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. But I was carrying something different now. When I closed my office door behind me, the first thing I did was pull James Dalton's file from the cabinet. The folder was worn soft at the edges, pages slightly curled from years of handling. His was one of the few cases I knew almost by heart, at least I thought I did. I spread the documents across my desk, the original admission notes from 11 years ago, the Mills incident report, my own follow-up summaries, and a small pile of scans showing a brain injury that should have silenced him forever. I picked up the accident report first. The handwriting from the Mills safety officer was neat, almost too neat. It said James had been working alone on the upper platform when he slipped and fell approximately 12 feet, striking his head on the machinery below. The report noted no witnesses except the foreman, who had arrived moments later. No mention of an argument, no mention of the upstairs office. I turned to the hospital's own intake notes from that day. The ER attending had recorded blunt force trauma to the head, loss of consciousness, and subsequent swelling in the frontal lobe. The story matched the Mills version exactly, almost word for word. It didn't feel right. People tell stories differently, even when the facts are straightforward. Here, every detail lined up too perfectly, as though rehearsed. I leaned back, rubbing my temple. If what James said earlier was true, that he'd been pushed, that there'd been an argument, then someone had made sure the paper trail didn't reflect it. A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. Mary stepped in, holding her coat over her arm. "I thought you'd gone home," I said. "I couldn't," she admitted, taking the chair across from me. "I keep hearing his voice. After so long, it's like having him back for a moment." She glanced at the papers on my desk. "What are you looking at?" "His old records," I told her. "Mary, what do you remember about the day of his accident? Not what you were told, what you remember." She hesitated. "It was a Tuesday. I was at the grocery store when the mill called. They said Jimmy had been hurt, that I needed to get to the hospital. By the time I arrived, they wouldn't let me see him until after surgery. The foreman, what's his name? No, Grant, he told me Jimmy slipped. Said it was a freak thing." "Did Jimmy ever mention problems at work?" Mary's lips tightened. "He didn't complain much. But a few weeks before the accident, he said something about a disagreement over missing equipment. He didn't name names." Her words lit something in the back of my mind. Missing equipment wasn't in any of the reports. "Do you know if anyone else heard him talk about it?" She shook her head. "Jimmy kept to himself. But if he said he was pushed, Doctor, I believe him." After she left, I decided to dig further. The hospital still kept microfilm archives of local newspapers for legal reference, and I knew the library downstairs had the Mills name in several old articles. I signed out a temporary key and headed there. The basement smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The hum of the microfilm reader was steady as I scrolled through headlines from that winter. Most were routine, holiday parades, school board meetings, until I found one dated 2 days after James's accident. "Lumber mill worker injured in fall, stable condition." The article quoted the foreman, Grant Willis, saying, "It was just bad luck. We take safety seriously, but sometimes accidents happen." No mention of anyone else present. No investigation noted. I kept reading, moving back a few weeks in the archives, and found a smaller piece buried on page 6. Mill reports missing equipment, no leads. It named Grant Willis as the one who'd filed the report with police. I sat back, letting the pieces arrange themselves in my mind. A disagreement over missing equipment. An accident in a place where James now claimed he'd been pushed. A witness whose version never wavered. Back upstairs, I stopped by the staff lounge for coffee. The place was empty except for Harold, one of our oldest respiratory therapists. He'd been at the hospital longer than I had, and he had a way of remembering small-town gossip better than anyone. "Harold," I began carefully, "do you remember when James Dalton was first admitted here?" He raised his eyebrows. "Of course I do. Whole town was talking about it. Why? What was the talk about the mill back then?" He leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Officially, it was a slip and fall. But off the record? Folks said there was bad blood between him and Grant. Something about inventory numbers not matching. You know how it is, tight-lipped when it matters. Did anyone ever say they saw it happen?" Harold shook his head. "Not that I heard. Just whispers. And in this town, whispers don't go far if someone important doesn't want them to." I thanked him and left, my coffee cooling in my hand. The more I looked, the less this felt like an accident at all. That afternoon, I went back to room 12. James was asleep, his breathing slow and even. Mary was knitting again, the soft click of her needles filling the quiet. "He's been resting most of the day," she said. The therapist came by, but he was too tired to do much. I stood at the foot of his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. 11 years of silence had hidden a story that might have never come out if he hadn't spoken this morning. And now, I felt the pull of something I hadn't expected, an obligation to see where it led. Not because I was his doctor, but because I'd heard the truth in his voice. As I turned to leave, Mary's voice stopped me. "If you find out who did this to him, promise me you'll tell me first." I met her eyes. "I promise." When I stepped into the hallway, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the windows streaked and the sky a pale, clouded gray. It felt like the whole day had shifted under my feet. I'd come in expecting another routine Tuesday. Instead, I was walking straight into a past that had been buried for over a decade, one that James Dalton had just started to unearth. And I had no idea how deep it went. The next morning, the sky was the pale gray of unpolished steel, the kind that made the whole hospital feel hushed. As I walked down the hall toward room 12, I noticed Mary already inside, her chair pulled close to the bed. She was holding James's hand, speaking to him in a low, steady voice. When I stepped in, she looked up. "He's been more alert today," she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. James's eyes shifted toward me. They were clearer than I'd seen in days, still tired, but carrying a focus that made me pause. I pulled a chair beside him, leaning forward. "James," I began, "yesterday you told me something important. Do you feel ready to talk more?" His jaw tightened slightly before he spoke. "Grant." The name hung in the air like a suspended weight. Mary's grip on his hand tightened. "Grant Willis." He nodded once, slow but deliberate. "What about him?" I asked, my voice careful, almost holding its breath. James's gaze drifted toward the ceiling as if replaying something in his mind. "We argued." He said, "Keep quiet about the tools." Mary glanced at me, her face a mix of shock and confirmation. "Missing equipment?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered. Said it would fall on me if I didn't stop asking. The small hairs at the back of my neck prickled. I had read the report about those missing tools in the archives just yesterday, and now here it was, linked directly to the man who had given the only official account of the fall. What happened after that? I pressed gently. His lips pressed together for a moment, his breath catching. We were in upstairs office. He stepped close. His hand trembled faintly against the blanket. Pushed. Hard. Mary's eyes filled instantly, but she didn't speak. I felt the slow thump of my pulse in my ears. "James, did anyone else see this?" He hesitated, searching his memory. He closed the door. "No one." The clinical part of me wanted to stay neutral, to record his words without reacting. But the human part, the one that had seen Mary knit in that chair for over a decade, the one that had heard James whisper, it wasn't an accident, couldn't ignore the gravity in his voice. I turned to Mary. "This matches what you told me yesterday about his concerns before the accident." She nodded, her eyes never leaving her brother's face. I knew it. I knew it all these years, but I didn't have proof. James's breathing grew heavier, so I signaled for a nurse to check his oxygen. He watched us fuss around him with a faint, almost tired patience. But when the nurse stepped back, he spoke again. He told me no one would believe me. Said I'd be out of a job before I could even talk. Mary's lips trembled. "And then he made sure you couldn't talk at all," she whispered. I stayed quiet, letting her words hang. In my years in medicine, I'd heard countless stories of accidents and misfortunes. But something about this, 11 years of silence, and now this sudden clarity, made every instinct in me say this wasn't a coincidence. The nurse excused herself, leaving the three of us in a silence thick enough to feel. "James," I said finally, "are you afraid of what will happen if we tell someone?" His gaze shifted to me. "No, afraid that he'll hurt someone else." It was the first time his words carried not just memory, but intent. I leaned back, feeling the weight of an ethical boulder settle squarely in my lap. As his physician, my job was to protect his health, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone dangerous was still walking free in our small town. Mary must have sensed my conflict. "Doctor," she said, "you know as well as I do, if we go to the police now, after all this time, they'll call it confusion. They'll say it's his condition talking." She wasn't wrong. A decade-old injury, a patient just now speaking in broken sentences, it wasn't the kind of testimony that would stand tall in a courtroom. But that didn't mean nothing could be done. "James," I said, "would you be willing to speak to someone else? Not police. Just someone I trust to listen." He gave a slow blink, the faintest nod. That afternoon, I called in a favor from someone I'd known for years, Sarah Lane, a retired nurse who had once worked in the ER. She'd grown up in Springfield, knew most of the town's players, and had a way of getting people to talk without pushing. Sarah arrived just after lunch, her presence warm but steady. She pulled her chair close to James's bed, speaking to him like an old friend. Within minutes, he was telling her the same details he'd given us. Names, the argument, the push. She listened without interrupting, nodding gently at the right moments. When she stepped out with me afterward, her voice was low. "Laura, I believe him. I've heard enough workplace accidents to know when something smells off. And this one stinks." That night, I couldn't sleep. The words he'd spoken, pushed, tools, keep quiet, played on repeat in my mind. I imagined the upstairs office, the slam of a door, the force of hands against a man's chest. And then the fall. The next morning, I came in early. Mary was in her usual spot, her knitting resting in her lap. James was awake, his eyes following me as I walked in. "Morning," I said softly. "Morning," he replied, surprising me with the ease of it. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," he admitted. "But lighter." Mary smiled faintly. "He's been asking what day it is." I told him it's Wednesday. James looked at me. "Feels like more than 11 years." I sat down beside him, and for the first time, I let myself drop the strictly clinical demeanor. "James, I can't promise what will come of this. But I can promise I'll make sure the right people know what you told us." His eyes softened. "That's enough." Mary reached over, placing her other hand on mine. "Doctor, whatever you do, make sure no one else has to sit in a chair like I did for 11 years. I nodded, the weight of her words pressing deep. Leaving the room, I knew this was no longer just about a patient's medical chart. The truth had come out, and it was mine to carry forward. And there was no going back. 5. A different kind of justice. The day after James told me he trusted me to make sure the right people knew, I stood in my office staring at the phone for a long time. The police weren't the first call I made. Instead, I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. My cousin, Daniel, who'd worked as a claims investigator for a major insurance company before taking an early retirement. He picked up on the third ring. "Laura? It's been a while. I need your advice," I said, skipping small talk. "Not medical. Legal, or at least close to it." He chuckled. "That's a first from you. Go on." I told him, carefully, about a patient with a long-ago workplace accident, how details were surfacing that didn't match the official story. I didn't use James's name, but Daniel didn't need it to follow the thread. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I need to know how to make something stick, without putting the patient through a circus he can't handle." There was a pause. "You want justice," he said slowly, "but not the kind that ends up in court." "That's right." He exhaled. "Then you need leverage, not headlines." The word lodged in my mind like a seed. Leverage. That evening, after my rounds, I sat in room 12 with Mary. She'd finished knitting another scarf, dark green, with small flecks of gold in the yarn, and was folding it neatly in her lap. "Mary," I said, "if there was a way to make sure Grant couldn't hurt anyone else, without dragging James through a public mess, would you want that?" She didn't even hesitate. "Just, that's all I've ever wanted." "Then I'll need your help," I said. Her eyebrows rose. "What do you need me to do?" The plan that formed over the next few days wasn't dramatic. There would be no confrontations in dimly lit alleys, no dramatic courtroom scenes. This was about precision and about letting Grant trap himself. First, I reached out to a contact at the local paper, a journalist named Emma who owed me a favor from when I'd given her background on a public health piece years back. I told her about a retrospective feature on workplace safety at the mill, something that might highlight overlooked stories. I kept my voice casual, but I made sure to drop Grant's name as the foreman during the period in question. Emma was sharp enough to read between the lines. "You want me to stir the water without making waves," she said. "Exactly." Within a week, the paper ran a small piece, just a few paragraphs, about the mill's safety record, mentioning that a certain foreman had overseen multiple incidents over the years. Nothing accusatory, Just suggestive. 2 days after it ran, Harold from Respiratory stopped me in the hallway. Heard the Mills board is asking questions about the old days. Grant's not looking too happy. Meanwhile, Mary began visiting old friends from the mill days. Over coffee and pie, she dropped bits of conversation about things Jimmy might be remembering. She didn't accuse anyone outright, just let the words hang where gossip could do its quiet work. One afternoon, I stepped into James's room to find him awake and surprisingly alert. Mary was reading him the paper, her voice low. When she finished, he looked at me. "You're doing something," he said. I smiled faintly. "We're making sure your story isn't forgotten." His lips curved slightly. "Good." That night, I got a call from Daniel. "He's spooked," he said without preamble. "A buddy of mine in the insurance game says Grant's been sniffing around about whether old claims can be reopened. He's worried something's coming." "Perfect," I said. The next step was subtle but decisive. Daniel drafted a letter, not from us, but from an anonymous source, to the Mills Board of Directors. It didn't accuse anyone outright. Instead, it asked whether the board had ever conducted a full review of workplace injuries under Grant's supervision. The wording was just careful enough to imply liability without stating it. I printed the letter on plain white paper and mailed it from a post office 2 towns over. Within a week, the whispers grew louder. Harold told me the mill had quietly put Grant on administrative leave. Mary brought James the news during her visit. "He's gone from the mill," she said, her voice trembling with relief. James closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. "Finally." But our work wasn't quite done. I wanted a final layer of protection. Through Emma, the journalist, I arranged for the paper to run another piece. This one focusing on anonymous accounts of unsafe practices at the mill in years past. The article didn't name James, but it made it clear that some injuries had been questionable. The beauty of it was that Grant couldn't push back without drawing more attention to himself. One rainy Thursday, I walked into room 12 to find James sitting propped up with 2 pillows, his gaze steady on me. "You kept your promise," he said. "I told you I would." Mary looked at me then, her eyes glistening. "Doctor, you did more than we ever expected." I shook my head. "No. All I did was make sure the truth had room to breathe." James gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That's enough for me." From that day forward, the tension that had hung over Mary seemed to lift. She still came every morning, still brought her knitting, still read to him, but there was a new lightness in her voice, as though the weight of 11 years had shifted off her shoulders. For me, the shift was quieter, but no less real. I'd learned that justice didn't always wear a badge or walk into a courtroom. Sometimes it was quieter than that, a slow, deliberate clearing of the air, a way of making sure the wrong person no longer held the power to hurt. A month later, Emma stopped by the hospital to drop off a copy of the paper. She tapped the front page. Grant sold his house. Rumor is he's moving out west. I thanked her and slipped the paper into James's chart, not as medical documentation, but as a marker, a reminder that, in this case, justice hadn't been loud or public, but it had been done. That evening, as I left the hospital, the sunset spread across the sky in deep orange and gold. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, watching the light fade over the town. Behind me, the hospital windows glowed warm against the cooling air. And for the first time in years, I felt like the balance had shifted, just enough to matter.